Hannah Luera, thanks so much for getting us started. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Creighton Webb. I'm the owner and CEO of Sunwest Communications. We're a Dallas, Texas-based public relations and public affairs firm. I want to thank you all for joining us and being with us. We have an all-star cast, particularly if you live in Texas or in the Southwest, of panelists who are joining us today. It is 12 noon here on Thursday, the 25th of June, 2020. And welcome to our Sunwest Communications webinar, The State of the Media Amidst National Tragedy and COVID-19. Of course, no question that the media over the last number of months, if not always, is on the front line of whatever is going on in our world. And of course, with the COVID-19 pandemic, and then of course, since the killing of George Floyd and the protests that have followed, the media has been right there all along, and in many ways, personally, if not intimately, impacted, as I think we'll hear from some of our panelists today. It's also such an interesting time in the news business in general. The business model, an evolving business model, changing and truly challenged in many ways, as I think we'll also hear today from our guests. But also, many would argue that the media drives our national, regional, if not local conversations. In many ways, controls the narrative about what we're thinking about, what we're seeing, the knowledge that we have. One of the most thought-provoking and interesting questions that I heard someone ask here just within the last month was, presuming that you agree that the epicenter of the global media is located in New York City, if the epicenter of COVID-19 in the United States had broken out in, say, Lincoln, Nebraska, or Boise, Idaho, for example, this pundit asked, would New York have shut down? And I think it's an interesting question. We're going to hear a little bit more about that today from our guests. I'm going to let our moderator introduce our panelists, but I get the pleasure of introducing her. Rebecca Rodriguez is a longtime friend and colleague. We worked together 20 years ago at CBS 11. She has a long and distinguished career as a journalist, as a television news reporter here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area in Seattle. Last stop in news was at WFAA Channel 8. She went on from there to get into the political world, God help her. Worked for the mayor of Arlington as a public information officer, went to DISD as the chief communications officer, had her own media consultancy, Ciano Media, and did a last stop as district director for Congresswoman Kay Granger out of Fort Worth. And now I am so pleased to tell you that she is a managing director and a partner and employee here at Sunwest Communications. Really excited to be working with Rebecca. So with that, let me turn it over to our moderator, who will in turn introduce our guests and get the conversation going. Rebecca, welcome, and let me turn it over to you.
Great, and thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. I can't overstate that. It's a little bit exhausting hearing you go through that litany on my resume, but I tell you what, it has put me in a great position to learn from some of the best folks I could ever possibly hope to work with. And among them are some of our guests. I'm so happy and so pleased to have all of you here. And let me just, without any further ado, get to these introductions. Carolyn Mungo joins us from WFAA, where she is the Vice President and Station Manager, and previously served as the station's executive news director for 8 years. Carolyn has overseen a transformation in news gathering to meet the changing needs of everyone, of course, with a focus on innovation and digital platforms. She has served on the National Advisory Board for the Poynter Institute for Media Studies and is currently on the board of the Texas Association of Broadcasters. Carolyn, thank you so much for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
Emily Ramshaw is a co-founder and CEO of the 19th, a nonprofit, nonpartisan newsroom reporting at the intersection of women, politics, and policy. She was also previously editor-in-chief of the Texas Tribune and began her career at the Dallas Morning News. She is the youngest member of the board of the Pulitzer Prize. Also joining us is John Mackay, a familiar face to so many of you. John retired just last year after 40 years at WFAA, or 40 years in journalism rather, many of those years at WFAA. He's been witness to some of the most significant events of our lifetime and recently was awarded a PhD in humanities, history of ideas. John, it's a pleasure to have you here and we look forward to hearing your perspective on recent events here. And Steve Pickett, of course, another good friend of mine, and I'm proud to say former colleague as well. An Emmy Award-winning journalist recognized nationally for his coverage of public education and some of the most notable events of our times, both local and global. I'm going to begin a little bit with what I guess what Creighton was talking about. But I recall during my time as a journalist, so often feeling as though I had a ringside seat to history in the making. We were watching history unfold. I think everybody, journalist and non-journalist, feels that way right now. It's just an incredible, remarkable time in our nation's history and globally as well. But to Creighton's point, I think we felt the impact in the United States of this COVID-19 epidemic in New York. And that certainly, I think, perhaps influenced our national coverage of it, and actually to more importantly, to the daily, briefings that we heard from Governor Cuomo. And I want your perspective, and we'll begin with Carolyn, on how you think that might have shaped the narrative moving forward.
Well, thanks for having me, guys. I'm happy to be a part of this panel. Texas is kind of its own planet, really. And, I think that whether or not local journalists here looked at New York and changed the trajectory of how we were covering it, I think there was so much going on in Texas that it just sort of mirrored it. And, when I see today that the city of Houston, the home of the Texas Medical Center, has got a issue with ICU beds, 97% capacity, it's just stunning to me. So while other states, I think, might have looked at New York and went, uh-oh, I think there was so much going on in Texas that we, I don't believe, ever really took our eyes off that ball, both from a political standpoint and a health standpoint. But, I will say that, Dallas is Market 5. We have a lot of experienced journalists, both in front of and behind the camera. And usually they can draw on that experience to help them with whatever comes along. But this is a brand new highway, right? And I've never had to have journalists walk out with security guards, vests, helmets, gas masks, go out daily worried about the health of not only themselves, but their families when they come back. So this is all overwhelming in a lot of areas, including the way we report.
To that point, Steve, I wanted to ask you a question as a reporter. Tell me when your day began to shift. At what point in time did the word come down and the newsroom said, we can't do things the way we've been doing it and we're going to change how we operate? And how did that impact you?
Let me apologize, first of all, and let you know that my technology here, I'm on here twice. I'm trying to make sure I get the right guys. I think it can possibly be me because I'm showing something else. I apologize for that because I thought I had it, but now I don't.
That happens sometimes with our technology, Steve. I can come right back to you, let you kind of get that situated.
You can see me now.
Okay, do you think you're good to go?
More than anything, Rebecca, the focal point is like any other story. I define it as a breaking news story. So as a breaking news story, we had to adapt, and very quickly. And so ironically, I was in Los Angeles on vacation when that city started to shut down. By the time I got back here, it was to operate effectively in a newsroom to care for the people who were out covering stories. We had to take into the same kinds of protocols in terms of coverage, separate photographers, drive in separate cars, but go find the story. That meant immediately obviously impact, not only economically, but from a health standpoint, and everybody was on board on trying to find the story. I think the easy part of coverage was, as we call it, head count. Dallas County Health Department, for example, really started focusing on data. But what did that mean? What did that look like? What was our responsibility to showcase people who were directly impacted? Newscast-wise, I think, for the most part, the access was showing what businesses were shut down and who couldn't go to work. What we were lacking, I think, is showing how families directly were impacted by the virus. Whether you were sick, if your child was sick, if you were worried about your parents, nursing homes, all of that. First and foremost, I think more than anything, was really trying to get a grip on what's most pressing. And what was most pressing to me in terms of news coverage were everyday ordinary people to tell their story first.
I would agree with that. Emily, I want to ask you a question here, and really kind of twofold to our original point about how perhaps this virus originating, obviously not originating, but having the biggest impact initially in the city of New York, perhaps influenced the narrative a little bit, and also to how it impacted your initiative with the 19th, which, as some of you may or may not know, is a very innovative platform. Really, I'll let you describe it, Emily, but really to study women's issues and at the intersection, as you put it, of policy and politics in a nonpartisan way. How has this impacted the mission of the 19th?
Sure. Well, I'll first addressing your first question. I mean, I think part of the challenge we're seeing in Texas right now is there was so much focus on New York and the crisis in New York that there is fatigue, and the media has been unrelenting, in my opinion. We haven't stopped, the folks on the screen haven't stopped, but the reality is, as folks in New York started to see their sort of lives getting, loosened up, those of us who are following that news feel like, all right, it's time for us to take that breather too, when the reality is we're now in the situation that New York was in. And so I do think part of the fatigue and being just sort of over this and exhausted as a country is leading to, I think, some of the higher rates that we're seeing in Texas right now. So that is a fascinating trajectory and trend. For me personally, I know many of you from my Tribune days. I was just sort of in the midst of launching a startup this summer or this fall when all of this really blew up in a big way. And for us, it's had an effect on everything from the standpoint of our fundraising to our corporate underwriting to really just how we sort of think about the whole business model of how we're launching the 19th, which we're billing as the country's first nonprofit, nonpartisan newsroom at the intersection of women, politics, and policy. We took a beat in March and we thought maybe we should just put this whole thing on hold. We've worked so hard. Are we going to lose all of this in the midst of a pandemic? But the reality was the storytelling felt too important. Women are disproportionately affected by COVID in every way except for mortality rates, whether it's the people who are being infected on the front lines as healthcare workers, who 3/4 of them are women, whether it's, primary caregivers in families who are navigating this sort of sandwich generation. There was a week early in this process where my husband had COVID. I was on the phone with donors while he was moaning in the bedroom, and I was stiff-arming my 4-year-old to keep her away from me with no childcare so I could try to make this business, help this business get off the ground. So it's been wild. We're still forging ahead. We're launching in August as we intended to. But we've hired a staff where 80% of the people we've hired I've never met in the flesh, which is just a really astonishing way. Everything I do now is like this. So that's a long-winded way of saying crazy times for everybody.
Great. That kind of sums it up. But John, let me ask you a question too, though. One of the things that has fascinated me as a former news person was seeing how quickly our newsrooms were able to adapt, how quickly everybody was able to say, we can't do things the way we've been doing it, and beginning tomorrow, we're going to do things differently. What has been your impression to watch that evolve?
Well, I think one of the things that fascinated me the most is I got in this business the week after Jimmy Carter was elected president. And from that time to this, I don't think, we've certainly had a lot of crises. 9/11, we had Ebola in Dallas, but there hasn't been anything to my knowledge that has affected how we do the news as much as what we've seen in the last few months. So the amazing thing is people have had to really reinvent how you cover things. And I think the one thing that really I've been fascinated by is who knows what accurate facts are. I mean, every platform, every type of journalism has to be based upon accurate information. And now, unfortunately, information by some people on all sides has been weaponized. And so as a result, what you think is factual today may not necessarily be the case in an hour from now or tomorrow. And the public, it's been difficult for us, of course, as journalists, because the public is depending on us to have vetted all those facts and all that information. So I've seen that change, plus this I've always tried to distinguish between journalism and social media platforms. But the difficulty is now, because most people get their initial news from the social media platform, is you have to not only worry about the facts that you know, but trying to clarify the information that people have received through social media. So it's pretty tough. It's pretty tough. Really tough for, I think, everybody involved.
I would say so. I would agree. Carolyn, let's talk a little bit about, you mentioned it briefly there, that there's the strain and the stress that journalists are having to really endure. This has been a very long and ongoing season so far. And, it's interesting, we began talking about this webinar, 6 weeks ago or so, I'd say probably early, middle of May. And then certainly with the incidents in Minneapolis with the death of George Floyd, that added a different layer of responsibility on journalists covering the protests and all. Tell me what that kind of constant drumbeat of I guess, responsibility that has put on the shoulders of journalists, not just in, those making decisions about which way to go, how to cover it, but those actually on the field.
Yeah, it is unprecedented, like John said, and we're doing our job so dramatically differently now, just the workflow and the systems, and that has a mental impact. Forget about, what they're covering, it's how they're covering it is draining. The power of television is the visual image. And when, the only thing you really have is to edit one Zoom interview next to another with some file video, that's nothing. What we would like to do is tell those personal stories, going into someone's dining room, sitting down with people who have just been laid off. I mean, the power and the impact of the visual are things journalists want to do, television journalists want to do. And from a safety protocol standpoint, they can't. So there's that layer as well. We listened to our reporters and our photographers probably 3 weeks in, and it was clear that they needed a mental break. So it wasn't me, it was our news leadership team, thank God, put together a 4-day, 10-hour work week for photographers and reporters. How they did it, I don't know. But the response we got back from having that extra day in those really tight times of COVID and racial equality and protest, that was almost like winning the lottery for these crews. And so, that was one way we were able to give them the break they needed. But, they still got to go out there. And I am learning more about our journalists' personal lives than I would have ever learned before. And John, because you worked in our room, just like any other television newsroom, a lot of bosses would be like, leave your personal crap at home, come in, do work, and go back to your personal crap. But right now, we have to hear about a lot, and we need to. High-risk conditions, child care issues, these are things that, now matter because it so impacts the story today. Not that we ignored it before, but I'm asking questions like I'm an HR person now, okay? Because I have to, and it's warranted. That's a dramatic change.
You mentioned something though, both of you talked about, Emily and Carolyn, Zoom, the use of Zoom and how that has in some ways impacted, perhaps it's subtracted from the ability to tell stories the way that we, I think, are accustomed to seeing these stories most impactfully told. But I think, let me ask you, Emily, do you see opportunity in sort of some of these changes that we're having to embrace as a culture, and then certainly in the newsroom?
I mean, obviously, I think all of us miss being in close quarters with our colleagues. Like, that's part of the reason you get into the news business, is for that sort of rough and tumble atmosphere. But I do think, when you talk about equity and opportunity, I do think a lot of industries, the media included, are seeing ways that there are lessons we can sort of take from this time and extend out. I mean, I think there were a lot of newsroom editors before who thought, well, I need my team to be in the newsroom. They really need to either be out in the field or directly sitting where I can see them working shoulder to shoulder with me. We've seen over time a lot of women leave the industry, candidly, in their 30s and 40s when they try to balance having a family or taking care of their aging parents with the realities of a really fast-paced news environment. And I think, part of of the reason we founded the 19th was to give women those kinds of flexibility, really extensive family leave and caregiver leave policies, and fully remote workplaces where our team could work wherever they had the best childcare and the best elder care. We never imagined our entire staff would need all of those benefits at once. I don't think any of us in this business did. And suddenly we're seeing people in their living rooms and in their kitchens with their kids and their dogs, and we're realizing the challenges that they're facing at home. And I think that's created a new level, I think, of empathy and of understanding. And I hope that we can take that forward into the future of this industry.
That's one of the things I've read about it, in fact, is sort of peeling back that illusion that there was a hard divide between home and work, because for so many we know there's not. And yet, whenever you've got, the ability to be in an office, it does feel sterile, it does feel separate from home, and you can leave those things behind. When you're zooming from your living room and your child is underfoot, it's a different matter entirely.
Exactly.
We also mentioned briefly, Carolyn, talking about obviously the George Floyd incident, Minneapolis, and for a time, it seemed very quickly the narrative shifted from focus on COVID-19 and how it's impacting to the racial injustices and inequities. And John, I want to direct this question to you first, simply because of your experience in journalism for 4 decades. What was it about that incident that became a flashpoint? Why are we seeing change now? We've seen protests in the past. We've seen some protests that have led to change, but we are seeing more rapid response and change culturally and in a corporate manner, I think I can ever recall.
Well, I think about the fact that the Rodney King incident was videotaped. There have been others that have been videotaped, and I think that number one, the increased use of social media, the fact that people are more adept at getting their information or their viewpoint to a larger number of people, has resulted in the media really having to react to how the public is acting. And so with the George Floyd situation, what you have, I think, are a number of people around the country who, it's not just about you and your neighbor and who's down the street and who's in your town. People in Dallas and in Fort Worth are finding out just as quickly as people in Minneapolis what happened. People in New York, what happened. There are very many different things about all of this. Certainly the fact that we've all been home, I think has played a role in all this. The fact that everybody has been, or many people have been in the house, has had a lot to do with this. We've had our attention on one specific thing, really, which was COVID. And then this comes out, and it comes out at a time when we were also seeing people start to talk about ending the shutdown, as people like to call it, and moving outside. So many things have come together, I think, to make that happen. That's number one. Number two, there have been many protests. Certainly in my years, I have never seen protests that have engaged so many different kinds of young people as I see now. And there have been protests. I can remember seeing video out of China years ago when in Tiananmen Square, when they were saying things like "We shall overcome," and being surprised by that. But now it's quite clear that young people in particular see what they see on the phone as not just a local issue, even if it's in some other country. They see it as something they should be involved in. So I think a lot of things are coming together at this particular moment to give us a different world. And we as journalists are really trying to hold on to it all to try to make some sense out of it.
Steve, let me ask you, as a reporter covering these protests, what has that been like? We've seen reporters, in harm's way over and again over the past, few weeks. Even witnessed the arrest of a CNN reporter during a live report. Tell me your sense of what it has been like and how this is different, perhaps, from previous moments.
I don't think it's frankly different. I've been to Iraq, been to Haiti. I've been all over this country. I've been here in Dallas with many other protests. And I think John struck on something in terms of not just maybe the environment reporters or other people face in these protests. I mean, in larger protests in this city from shootings and what happened on July 7th. I think the distinction is in terms of coverage and how people are responding, frankly, is coverage reflects value of people, and value of people in those particular protests seem to look like more of our viewers and around this country. And so, you know, who had cart before the horse? People are now paying attention, newsrooms paying more attention that this protest in this community this time looks different. Oh, let's pay attention to it. I've heard editorial leaders in newsrooms not listen to the core of what does Black Lives Matter mean? Well, 8 minutes and 46 seconds may give you a real indication of what is that person of value. And when people see that example as opposed to, John just said it, we've seen video before of Rodney. We've seen a woman in Fort Worth, Texas, call the police show up, throw her to the ground. We've seen a Black teenager thrown to the ground, Kenny. We've seen these examples. We've seen a Black man sitting in his apartment and a police officer shows up and shoots him. What's different this time? People may be seeing a reflection of themselves in this, in the humanism of what happened in 46 seconds. And those young people are going to the streets, valuing Black lives and making sure they're in partnership with it. And our coverage now is maybe reflecting.
Those of you joining us.
Rebecca, can I interrupt for a second?
Absolutely.
You know, as I'm sitting, I'm older than anybody on your panel. And as I'm sitting here thinking, I went to college from 1972 to 76. But from 68 to 74, I'm trying to imagine what those students who were politically active, I mean, very politically active during the Vietnam War, how those students would have reacted if they had the cameras and the video opportunities and the means of communicating that they had today. And they probably would be doing a lot of them the same things that you see now, because during the war, people were very vocal. They just didn't have things just weren't live. You know, they didn't have if you had a telephone, it had to be hooked up to something, and it certainly wasn't going to be anything going live. So as we're sitting here talking about this, I'm thinking about that, and that may be something that as journalists we need to take a look at in terms of how our society has evolved over the past half century.
Oh, absolutely. You know, I just wanted to welcome our audience again. If you're just joining us, you are joining us with a wonderful guest panel here for State of the Media Amidst National Tragedy and COVID-19. And we're talking about, obviously, the impact this has had, not just obviously in newsrooms, but culturally. We're also taking questions from our participants as well. And I do have a question from one individual who wants to know, and we sort of talked a little bit about this in terms of media credibility and sort of the climate right now. And she wanted to know, how do you vet information in a newsroom? And Emily, I know you have experience in, you know, a couple of very highly, you know, experienced newsrooms. Share that a little bit with our audience. What is that vetting process for a reporter and then for the broader editorial staff?
Sure. I mean, it's, you know, I think as anyone on this panel would say, it's incredibly robust. I mean, you know, we have very high thresholds for who we trust and who we don't trust, how many sources we need to confirm something, whether we accept anonymous sources and on what conditions. You know, for an organization like ours, you know, the bar is very high. It's 3 unidentified sources confirming the same thing. Other news organizations have, you know, some have lower bars than that. But I think, It requires enormous caution and insight. And I think where we get into trouble is this sort of rush to be first at all costs. I mean, my ethos is really sort of, best, not first. I want to get it absolutely right. Our little scrappy news organization that isn't even fully off the ground yet, we actually really broke the Breonna Taylor story. The family, her name had not been identified publicly. Her family reached out to us and said, we see that Black men who are killed by police are having their stories heard far and wide. We feel like Black women who are killed by police aren't getting the same kind of coverage in the media. And we were super careful with that story. We tried to get as many details as we could from the authorities. There were very few, which was telling. We did a lot of due diligence with her family. I think we have to be cautious, but we also have to make sure that we're getting the story out there. So I think, maybe others can jump in on specific processes here if that's of interest, but I think the people you see on the screen take accuracy. Accuracy is the high bar. It's what we must meet if we're going to be trusted.
It is difficult, I would say, in stories of this magnitude, particularly in the culture of social media. These stories right now are evolving about events. What we try to delve into is beyond the event, but the issue, the impact. And so if someone calls you, and people are incredibly media savvy, someone will call a newsroom and say, this is happening, come cover us. This happened to me, come cover us. A story less than 24 hours ago in this community, in Glen Heights, of a business owner accused of making racial epithets. It garnered 200 protesters in front of his shop yesterday. Now, generally speaking, the vetting process, if you will, would have been, well, what shop is it? And who is this guy? And who can confirm that he actually said it before you were actually thinking about putting this on television? Choppers were up yesterday, and our eyes confirmed the fact there were 200 plus people there, and that became the story. Now, vetting, the process of finding out is it accurate what that man said, the accusation against him, and what's come from that is a process. But in this day and age, it was get to that story and get beneath the story once you're there.
John, there's a question directed specifically for you, and our viewer wanted to know, do you think the national media is more to blame for creating a divisive environment than the local media, perhaps?
Question for me?
Yes, that was for you specifically. Yeah.
I think I said earlier, I think what's happened is many people are starting to weaponize information. Information has always been a weapon. I don't know if we've necessarily understood that in this country, but in other countries they do understand that information and access to it is important. What has happened is I think you've got, people will disagree with this, but CNN, MSNBC is probably left of center. Fox is right of center. CNN tries to stay in the middle, but many of its people are quite clearly invested in one side or the other. And so the difficulty has been that rather than try, because of I think Emily said this, because of the pace of things, people are accumulating bits of information that they're clear about. But the problem is who you're getting the information from to get a complete picture of what it is that's going on. You got that. Plus, I've always believed there's a problem in particularly the national electronic media, in that we have switched from being a group of people who say, watch this, to watch me. And that to me is a very serious mistake, because what it says is that the news isn't as important as me telling you what it is. And the news is what should be the most important thing. But yeah, do I think the national media plays? Yeah, we have to relook at what we're doing. We have to look at our relationship again with social media platforms on the national level. And we're all, I'm retired now, so I guess I can say it. I mean, we're all pushed to some degree by what's on Twitter. And particularly now, since the president does a lot of his communicating on Twitter, we're pushed to get things out as quickly as possible because it's been on Twitter, and it's been the means by which some of our sources, our elected officials are trying to communicate with the general public. And what we need to do is perhaps, as Emily said, slow down a bit. You know, I would much rather, let me give you one good story. When the police officers were killed in Dallas, July 7th, a few years ago, I can remember hearing in my ear, this is what's going on, that there were 5 officers shot. And then there was some indication that the 5 were dead, the 6 might be dead. But that wasn't confirmed. And you have to ask yourself at that point, what's more important, your reputation or character? To me, I've always believed that character is more important than reputation, because if you have good character as a news organization, as an individual, then you'll have a great reputation. But people wanting to be first are looking for a reputation. So if character is what's going to drive you and drive your newsroom, I think that's a key thing. And fortunately, we were able to vet that information and quickly as possible make it clear to people what was really happening. But nationally, yeah, I'm a little hesitant about what I see. So I spend a lot of time looking at all three different major ones, and also some from overseas as well. I hope that answered the question.
Can I add to this? I also
Yes.
think we need to talk about business models in all of this and what we're incentivizing and what we aren't incentivizing. And look, you all know me well enough to know that I really drink the nonprofit Kool-Aid at this point. I started my career in the for-profit space, survived 4 rounds of layoffs in my first 5 years at the Dallas Morning News, was trying to figure out, I'm a lifer in journalism. My parents are both journalists. I didn't know what this industry was going to look like for me, and then took the leap into the nonprofit arena. And the shift that happens when you're no longer obsessed with how many clicks you get on a story, because that's what's driving your revenue stream, your advertisers, it changes the game. The headlines don't need to be as salacious. We can take a beat, we can take a breath. We don't have to be first. We can focus really on being the best, on being the most thorough. It just changes the name of the game, or it has changed the name of the game for me in my career. And I think when we look at the national, to me, it's less about sort of national media versus local media, and it's more about what we're incentivizing in our newsrooms. So just a thought to add there.
Great point, Carolyn. No, absolutely. Carolyn, let me ask you this, because this is something we also wanted to talk about, is, we see the impact that COVID-19 has had on our economy, the lockdowns, and the recovery may not be an absolute bounce back, as some would like to believe. What do you see in terms of realistically how this is impacting local media and coverage, and having to consider what that might look like?
Yeah. I have a different hat now. I spent 30 years in a newsroom and didn't have to worry about anything other than content. And now I'm seeing in the last year and a half other sides of the business. And it's a business, okay? It's a business. And, you see it in other, media companies with the dramatic layoffs that they've had to endure because of the loss of ad revenue. So, in our market, and I'm sure in markets across the country, our numbers have never been higher. Our 5 and 6 and 10 o'clock newscasts, the number of people watching television in this time since March has gone through the roof. It's upwards of 50, 60% in our early evening newscast. That's a lot of eyeballs, right? But we can't monetize that. And advertisers are canceling right and left. It's a brutal reality. We're not a nonprofit. It doesn't mean we're, doing more push alerts to try to get people, we've got the eyeballs. They're already with us. And they do, I think, have a higher trust for local journalists than they do national. I know it's starting to get, a little more equal, but right now I think that people trust local journalists more than national. But it's scary, guys. I mean, and our sales teams are working like dogs, and it is, it's an uphill battle. We need to have things get better so our journalists can remain employed, because we are working for a business. We try in our group company town halls to explain a little bit of the top line. We don't want it to be the journalist's burden, because that's not necessarily their burden. But I feel like now more than ever, we are more transparent with our newsrooms about what's happening in the bigger picture, because they're in the field and they see, my buddy got laid off, or a friend of mine lost their job just in the last several weeks. So they're very curious. I have found that they're hungry for more knowledge now about the business and about ratings, and because we're all in this together, kind of a deal. But I've found that they're hungrier than ever. But it's going to be a long journey, and I feel for our people on the sales side trying to make it work for all of us. And that's kind of a sad commentary, right? We're going to be okay if we sell to this, that's, journalism shouldn't be in that whole vein, but that's the reality we live in.
I understand that. And Emily, it's really to your point, what you're talking about in terms of the nonprofit model. Yet and still, how do you anticipate this pandemic, what we're seeing as a fallout from that, perhaps shape the future of the 19th?
I mean, I think for starters, obviously there's the journalistic conversation about both the pandemic, what this means for women, and also this moment just from the standpoint of, a sort of modern day civil rights movement that I certainly hope we're living through right now. All of that frames this coverage. But from the standpoint of the business model and the economics, I think it is a big question mark. We had been accounting for corporate underwriting, which is basically the nonprofit equivalent of advertising, for the next year, certainly in our first year, to be a hefty hunk of our annual revenue. And we've honestly zeroed that out for the next year. We just have no idea what it's going to look like. I think a few weeks ago when I looked at Mike Allen's newsletter in Axios, you all know Mike Allen, I'm sure, and it was unsponsored for the first time in probably ever. My heart dropped, because if Mike Allen's newsletter doesn't have a sponsor, what are the rest of us even doing? I mean, it's a scary time. Now, I will have to say, philanthropy is obviously a big piece of what we're doing as we launch this venture. And COVID slowed that down for a hot second, and then it picked back up. And we have found people remain deeply engaged. There used to be people there was no way I would get FaceTime with, because, people didn't live on Zoom. They weren't home. They were traveling all around the world. And now suddenly people of enormous means are stuck in their living rooms, and I get to have Zoom calls with them. There are weird silver linings in all of this that I think are working for a nonprofit. But yeah, the jury's still out. I never imagined I'd be launching a startup, a new business in a pandemic. It was not part of the game plan.
Hard to factor that in sometimes, it is. And I know we are fortunate to have all of you for the time that we have. And I know that Carolyn Mungo may have to leave a little bit earlier. Carolyn, if you drop off the screen, we'll understand why, but I want to say thank you in advance of that for your insight and the time you have spent with us. I really appreciate that.
Sure, it's an honor to be with these guys. You guys are amazing.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you, Carolyn. Steve, let me ask you a quick question, because looking at the screen here, I've really been enjoying the photo of your two sons. For those of us in our audience who may not realize, you're a dad, you've got two wonderful sons.
Right.
What has it been like as a parent, in the field, as a reporter, dealing with the economic uncertainty and then the racial conversations that are dominating? And then as a parent of two young sons, how are you working through this?
I apologize that you can't see my glowing face on the other one there, but I am on the other one there, Rebecca, but I can't get that one with my two boys off of your image. There's another one there where I'm on that camera. Patrick is now 28, Saeed is 9. Yes, my kids are 20 years apart. Both here at the house right now. Patrick is working in my office, working from home, and Saeed has been told to stay in his room until we complete this. Yeah, I can tell you this, and I'll be frank with you, I've been Black my whole life. So the concept of people defining you less as an individual, but as a member group, however they deem the value of the group, has been part of my life, my mother's life, my grandparents' life, and I see that in everything we cover. That's why I talk about the issue of whose voice do we value, and covered on every story, every single day. My kids are keenly aware of what's happened. They're paying attention to whether it be COVID or whether it be the issue of the anarchy that some people have defined in the streets and others define it as empowerment in the streets. To really say to this country, do you value me? That's where the storyline is for me, is a value. That's what I hear in my coverage for Black Lives Matter. And I think that's what my sons understand as well. I don't think much attention to individuals who throw rocks through windows or a woman who goes to the Wendy's and burns it down. I think they see a reflection of themselves going down the streets because they know the history, and we've taught them the history of you have to march and fight and argue to sit at the table of everything in American life. A newsroom, a schoolhouse, a state house. And I'm also reminded, and they both are old enough, Rebecca, to know their president as a man who looks like them. So they understand all of it. I don't think they're any more trouble than anyone else. I don't ever say to my children, I don't think I've ever had the conversation, hey, be aware that you're going to be different. I think inherent based on every way we live, that's always happened. In this neighborhood that I live in, the newsroom I work in, the restaurant I may go to, many Black people I know, that is the standard food.
There's another question from one of our participants here, asking about how do you change the perception in the public's eyes that the media is, the bad guy. And I think essentially what they're asking is how do you create better credibility and a better sense of credibility? How do you find yourselves as journalists handling that? I think, and I recall, facing it head on. This was quite some time ago. It's gotten only worse, but there is a general sense of mistrust. How
I don't have a problem. I would say to you, from my vantage point, America, the viewing public should view us with some trepidation. They should challenge us the same way we challenge people we interview. Verify, validate, do your job, as opposed to being worried about who trusts you. Now, in today's world, we know, and John and everyone else knows, that people are picking and choosing echo chambers, as I call them, finding media entities that they think they like, and therefore you go to those media entities and you hear your own voice. Our responsibility for CBS 11 or WFAA or Channel 5 or what have you is to cover those news and look straight ahead and do your job. And that's how you build trust. I want people to say, as someone said to me yesterday, Rebecca, I had no idea DeSoto was an economically viable community that's minority dominant. Well, that may be a reflection on the fact that we aren't covering DeSoto or Cedar Hill or Glen Heights or Red Oak, to remind people of what those rooftops and those communities just look just like Plano and Keller, Frisco, and what have you. They should look with us, I believe, with some trepidation until we validate for them that trust.
John, I wanted to ask you a question we were talking about, because this really, I think, is kind of a spinoff on the credibility question. I think folks have a problem making a distinction between commentary, opinion, and editorial news content. And then you have networks that really have an abundance of both, perhaps, and it's not maybe even evenly split. But John, I know you as an anchor had the opportunity to have those moments on air where it was labeled, it was your commentary, you had that moment for opinion. How did you walk that line, knowing that, so many times you were just you had to be the voice of objective observation, and yet you also had the opportunity to voice an opinion. And when did you make that decision to do so?
Actually, I didn't make that. The decision for me to make the right commentary was made for me by the management. I'm an old-fashioned guy. You either work on the op-ed page or you work in the news. I mean, that was me. But they wanted me to comment, and so I decided, and it was going to be every Friday, 6 o'clock, and it was 90 seconds. And I tried to comment on issues I thought that were based upon character, as opposed to based upon politics, because you're not going to solve that in 90 seconds. But you can try to address some issues of how people conduct themselves, I think, in 90 seconds, or you can certainly try to, or make people slow down a little bit in terms of their decision making. But we have to remember, we like to think now that there weren't these controversies that were going on. I was reading this morning that, New York Times published some excerpts of Mein Kampf. There were interviews with Osama bin Laden before he was alive. So the question that we, as journalists, I think, for journalists in this country, I think we have to provide fair access to as many ideas as possible. And people who are smart enough to put food on the table for their kids, they're smart enough, once they listen to it, to make their own minds up about whether or not they agree with them. But we just have to make sure that what we say is clearly identified as commentary or opinion, or it's part of the news. I think if you do that, that's fair. What we're having now with I call them bombardiers, the cable bombardiers who like to just get on there and fire off. What we're having now are people who mix all that. And once you have that mixing going on, you run into trouble, which is where we are.
Emily, tell me a little bit about how you've had this discussion, or how you've considered this issue of providing a platform for opinion, and striking that balance. Is it something that, how do you see the 19th moving forward in that direction?
So actually, we are not doing any opinion from go. Our reporting will be, I would not say sort of straight down the middle. This is not, we don't live in an era, I don't think, of both sidesism journalism. Our journalism will be rooted in fact and evidence and science. And, honestly, at the end of the day, I was raised by two very traditional journalists, and I believe in that ethos, but there are also things I stand for. I stand for civil rights and human rights and equity for women and racial justice. And I don't think I should have to sacrifice those things to tell really critical stories that empathize with women, across the political and ideological spectrum. I think empathy and space are sort of too often what's missing. It's women of color certainly have not seen themselves reflected in our national media landscape for the way that they ought to be. By that same standpoint, I would say a lot of conservative women say that they don't see themselves reflected in a lot of legacy or East Coast media. I think we need to do a better job of letting the people we cover, the people we seek to serve, see themselves reflected in our work. So I'm less, for me, I think the challenge with opinion is even those great people who, put food on the table for their kids, if they read the New York Times, they often don't know the difference unless you're sort of sophisticated and in the news business. Mm-hmm. It can be hard to decipher what's opinion, what's the op-ed page, what's the editorial page versus what is traditional journalism. And on social media, where a lot of people consume their news, it all gets sort of blended together in a Twitter feed. It doesn't say necessarily opinion : in front of everything when a person tweets it. And so it can be tricky. I think for us in these early days, our focus is on giving all of our readers as much news and information as we can to make their own decisions on how they feel about particular things. But there's a time and a place for all of this. And I loved watching John's opinion pieces, on the air. So.
Well, thank you. No,
Yes.
I appreciate that. And but I do think you're right. You know, I'm thinking about this as we're going along. It's true. I mean, if you go to Facebook and you go to the New York Times page, you're not sure if you're reading a straight out journalism piece or an opinion piece, unless it says on there opinion. And so I just think people want just information. And Emily, you hit on something that I wish I had touched on earlier, which is people, I want to see myself in a piece. You know, I think we've got people who are frustrated, who see everybody else around the campfire represented except them. And as long as they can see themselves every once in a while, I think that they'll give you a shot.
So we have time for, I guess, one more question from one of our participants. Is there concern about the fact that so many younger folks get their information from Twitter, from social media, and I would even add TikTok at this point? How do we reach, you know, someone who is not the typical news consumer demographic, but who certainly can benefit from an objective perspective?
I'll say this. I do believe that information is power, period. The mode in which they access the information with technology today is up to them. I mean, I'm watching my 28-year-old who never watches a newscast. He's hurting my ratings, but he is gathering information that I'm providing in others through a different form, via Twitter or Reddit or MSN or what have you. It is about choice. That's the distinction for me is choice. I think more than anything, I see young people, all people who are consuming information, leaning toward finding an echo of their voice and finding news, as opposed to realizing that there is every single day, and you're broadcast at 5, 6, and 10, or the Dallas Morning News or what have you, is giving you just the fact. But for some folks, the facts aren't enough because they may not want just the facts. There was a question here just asked Rebecca in this call about the NASCAR driver once he found out this wasn't in his garage, and you know, essentially, I think paraphrasing the question, you know, why didn't validate, verify that in terms of coverage, these kinds of things. Well, I call it the Rorschach test. Someone in that garage saw something hanging and defined it as a noose. Someone else had it and saw it as something else. And so the facts didn't lie. The facts based on what you saw. Was the intent to harm that person? Apparently not. But now it's been a conversation about, well, that's fake news reporting. That reporting evolved because the facts changed based on investigation. How people consume that information, who, what, when, where, and why, whether they get it on Twitter or any place or tonight's newscast, I still believe we are conveyors of information where value is needed. How they digest it, I don't have the answer for that one.
Emily?
I mean, look, these are news platforms now, whether we want them to be or not. And I think that we have a responsibility to serve our audiences wherever they may be. I mean, again, the really great thing about the nonprofit model for us is that we can focus on, it's less about drawing readers into our own platforms and more about distributing that work as widely as possible. And so that means for us, you know, promoting our work, publishing our work in other regional newspapers, on Univision, on the airwaves, but also on social media. And it's okay if some of our readers only consume a story in 3 slides on Instagram. Like, that's okay. We got to get comfortable with that. It's an extension of our brand and our mission, and it's a news platform. And so I think the challenge is, how many platforms do you have the resources to, you know, recompress your story for all these different platforms? But for us, it's just an extension of the publishing operation, and it's as much of a responsibility for us as posting on our website.
Yep, I can see that. I can see that. Well, thank you all so much. I think we're going to have to call it a wrap here. I've enjoyed this conversation more than you'll ever know, and appreciate your time during these incredibly busy, remarkable, and challenging times that we're all living through. I look forward to another conversation with all of you, I hope sometime soon. I want to also thank our participants for joining us and listening in, and we hope that you found the information here as interesting and as useful as all of us did. So John, Emily, and Steve, thank you again. For Sunwest Communications, I'm Rebecca Rodriguez, and thanks for joining us this afternoon. Have a good day, y'all.
Bye-bye.